Why did Queen Elizabeth II never need a passport? Think about that for a moment. Almost everyone needs a passport to travel internationally. You need one to board a flight. You need one to cross international borders. You need one to prove who you are and where you are from. But there was one woman who could travel around the world without ever having a British passport. Her name was Queen Elizabeth II. For more than 70 years, she was one of the most famous people on earth. She visited dozens of countries. She traveled across Europe, North America, Asia, Africa, and the Commonwealth. She crossed international borders countless times. But she never needed to carry a passport. And the reason is much stranger than you might expect. It all comes down to one unusual fact about the British passport. A fact hidden in the wording of the document itself. To understand this incredible story, we need to go back to the basic purpose of a passport. A passport is an official document that identifies you as a citizen of a particular country. It allows foreign governments to recognize your identity and nationality. When you arrive at an airport in another country, immigration officers check your passport. They want to know who you are. They want to know where you are from. And they want to know whether you are allowed to enter their country. For ordinary travelers, a passport is essential. But the British monarch is not treated like an ordinary traveler. The British passport is issued in the name of the reigning monarch. During Queen Elizabeth's reign, it was issued in the name of Her Majesty. So think about the strange situation this creates. The Queen was the person in whose name British passports were issued. She was not simply another person receiving a passport from the British government. The passport system itself operated under the authority of the Crown. That is why Queen Elizabeth did not need one. The official royal family website explained that the sovereign does not require a British passport because British passports are issued in the sovereign's name. In other words, Queen Elizabeth did not need a passport because the document was issued under her authority in the first place. That sounds almost unbelievable. But there is an important detail. This was not simply because she was rich. It was not because she was famous. And it was not because airport security decided to give her special treatment. It was connected to her constitutional position as the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom. And there is something even more surprising. Queen Elizabeth was the only member of the British royal family who did not need a passport. Her husband Prince Philip had one. Her son King Charles III had one before becoming king. Prince William had one. Prince Harry had one. Princess Anne had one. Other members of the royal family also traveled with passports. So why did they need passports while the Queen did not? Because they were members of the royal family. But they were not the reigning sovereign. That distinction is extremely important. The monarch occupies a unique constitutional position. The Queen was the head of state. Her identity was already officially established. When she traveled to another country, she was not simply arriving as a private British citizen. She was usually traveling as the head of state. Her visits were carefully organized by governments and diplomatic officials. Foreign governments knew exactly who was arriving. There was no question about her identity. There was no need for her to prove that she was Queen Elizabeth by showing a passport. Her official status was already known. Imagine an ordinary traveler arriving at an airport. They walk up to immigration control. They hand over their passport. The officer checks the photograph. The officer checks the name. The officer checks the nationality. The officer checks the travel permissions. But now imagine the person arriving is the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom. Her identity is known internationally. Her visit has already been arranged through diplomatic channels. Government officials know she is coming. Security teams know she is coming. Foreign governments know she is coming. So the normal passport process is simply not necessary in the same way. This is why the Queen could travel without carrying the document that almost everyone else needs. But Queen Elizabeth had another unusual privilege. And this one happened much closer to home. She did not need a driving license either. Yes. The Queen could legally drive without holding a driving license. In fact, she was the only person in the United Kingdom who could do so. Again, the reason was connected to the same basic principle. British driving licenses were issued in the name of the sovereign. So the reigning monarch did not need to hold one personally. But here is where the story gets even more interesting. Queen Elizabeth actually knew how to drive. And she learned during one of the most dangerous periods in British history. The Second World War. When Elizabeth was still a young princess, Britain was at war. She wanted to contribute to the war effort. In 1945, when she was still a teenager, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She trained as a driver and mechanic. She learned how engines worked. She learned how to maintain vehicles. And she learned how to drive. This was remarkable because she was the future Queen of the United Kingdom. Yet she was training alongside other women to support the country during wartime. Her experience behind the wheel later became famous. Even after becoming queen, Elizabeth was known for driving around private estates. She was particularly comfortable behind the wheel. So the idea that the Queen could drive without a license was not merely a technical legal detail. She actually drove. And she knew how to do it. Now you might be wondering something. If Queen Elizabeth did not have a passport, could she simply travel anywhere in the world whenever she wanted? Not exactly. This is where many versions of this story become misleading. Not having a passport did not mean that the Queen could ignore international laws. It did not mean she could simply arrive at any country's border without arrangements. Her international travel was highly organized. Diplomats coordinated her visits. Governments communicated with each other. Security teams planned every movement. Airports knew when she was arriving. Foreign officials knew who she was. Her travel was handled at a diplomatic level. So the Queen did not need a passport. But her international journeys were still carefully coordinated. And this distinction is important. A passport is one way of establishing identity and nationality. But a head of state can be recognized through diplomatic and governmental channels. Queen Elizabeth's position made that possible. She was one of the most recognizable people in modern history. There was almost certainly no immigration officer wondering who was standing in front of them. Everyone knew. The Queen had another fascinating relationship with passports. Every time the British monarch changed, the wording of British passports changed as well. During Elizabeth's reign, British passports referred to Her Majesty. After Queen Elizabeth died in September 2022, her son became King Charles III. The wording of new British passports changed to reflect the new sovereign. They were issued in the name of His Majesty. So the person who does not need a passport is also connected to the authority behind the passports used by millions of people. That is one of the strangest details about the British constitutional system. And it leads to an interesting question. What happens when a queen becomes a king? The rule stays essentially the same. The reigning monarch does not need a British passport. So the special status did not disappear when Queen Elizabeth died. It passed to King Charles III. Today, King Charles does not need a British passport for the same constitutional reason. But his family members still normally travel with passports. This tells us something important. The rule is not really about Elizabeth personally. It is about the office of the sovereign. Queen Elizabeth was special because she was the reigning monarch. King Charles is now in that same constitutional position. And that is why the unusual rule continues. Now imagine the contrast with an ordinary traveler. You are getting ready for an international vacation. You check your passport. You make sure it has not expired. You check whether you need a visa. You search for your boarding pass. You get to the airport. You wait in line. You go through security. Then you reach immigration. Your passport is checked again. For most people, international travel involves all of these steps. But Queen Elizabeth's situation was completely different. She could travel internationally without carrying the British passport that ordinary British citizens depend on. And there is a beautiful irony here. Millions of British passports were issued in the monarch's name. But the monarch herself did not need one. The person whose authority stood behind the document was the one person who did not need to possess it. That is what makes this fact so fascinating. It sounds like a loophole. But it is actually connected to centuries of British constitutional tradition. The British monarchy is one of the oldest continuous monarchies in the world. Many of its rules and traditions developed over hundreds of years. Some are purely ceremonial. Others have practical consequences. The passport rule is one of those unusual consequences. And it shows just how different the role of the monarch is from the role of an ordinary citizen. There is another detail that makes the story even more surprising. Queen Elizabeth was not the only head of state in history to have unusual travel arrangements. Heads of state often receive diplomatic treatment when they travel internationally. But the British system has a particularly unusual feature. The British passport is formally issued in the name of the sovereign. That is why the monarch is exempt from needing one. So the next time you see a British passport, remember what is hidden behind that little blue document. It is not simply an identification card. It represents the authority of the British state. And historically, that authority has been expressed through the crown. Queen Elizabeth's lack of a passport was therefore not a sign that she was ignoring the rules. It was actually the result of the rules themselves. And that is the part many people miss. The Queen did not need a passport because she was above the passport system in a very specific constitutional sense. She was the sovereign in whose name the passport was issued. And the same principle explains why she did not need a driving license. The license was issued in the sovereign's name. So the person at the top of the system did not need to receive the document personally. It sounds strange. But once you understand how the system works, it makes perfect sense. And there is one final twist. Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022. She had been queen for 70 years. During those 7 decades, she became one of the most traveled monarchs in British history. She visited countries across the world. She met presidents. She met prime ministers. She met kings and queens. She opened parliaments. She attended ceremonies. She traveled by airplane, helicopter, ship, and car. Yet throughout all those journeys, she never needed a British passport. She also never needed a driving license. 2 documents that are essential for millions of ordinary people were unnecessary for the reigning British monarch. And that is not because Queen Elizabeth was simply treated differently at airports. It was because the constitutional system itself placed her in a completely unique position. Today, that same principle applies to King Charles III. So the next time someone tells you that Queen Elizabeth never had a passport, remember the real reason. It was not a rumor. It was not an internet myth. And it was not simply royal privilege. It came from the constitutional relationship between the monarch and the documents issued in the monarch's name. The Queen did not need the passport. Because the passport was issued in her name. She did not need the driving license. Because the driving license system operated in her name. And that is one of the strangest facts about the British monarchy. The person behind the authority of the document was the one person who did not need the document herself. If you enjoyed this surprising story about Queen Elizabeth, the British monarchy, and the strange rules behind royal life, follow why for more fascinating facts, hidden history, and unbelievable stories that sound fake but are actually true.